You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining this special edition of the American Revolution. This month we have author Larry Kidder speaking about his new book, Defending Fort Stanwix. Mr. Kidder has published many books about the Revolution. In fact, I've spoken with him before about an earlier book. This interview was conducted during our monthly roundtable event in February of 2025. If you would like to join in on future roundtables and participate live, be sure to get on my mailing list. I discussed Larry's book with him for about 45 minutes. Then anyone who did join us live on Zoom for the event was able to ask questions. Here is our discussion, as I said, recorded on Zoom. Okay, welcome everyone to the American Revolution Roundtable. We're joined tonight by author Larry Kidder. His name on his book is William L. Kidder, but he goes by Larry. This is a copy of his most recent book, Defending Fort Stanwix, which is what we're going to be talking about tonight. Larry, welcome to our roundtable. It's a pleasure to have you back again. We've actually had you here, I think, once before, right?
Yes, we did. Definitely.
Larry's written a lot of books on the American Revolution, so we'll put up a list of his entire work at some point so you can take a look at them, but he's written a lot of great things. But we are here tonight to talk about Defending Fort Stanwix. Larry, why don't we just start? You can tell us why this particular topic interested you. I know you've mostly focused on New Jersey things, and this is, of course, the New York incident. Why'd you pick this one to go out of state?
Well, thanks, Mike, and thanks everybody for joining in tonight. I'm looking forward to telling you about this story because it's a story that really has grabbed me, even though everything else I've done has been on New Jersey. And I frequently get the question, why Fort Stanwix when you obviously have been doing a lot of research and things like that on New Jersey? I have to say, Mike said that I've written a number of books. This one on Fort Stanwix is the one that I wanted to write first, but it kept getting overshadowed by a new project. And I finally, after the book on Jacob Francis that I wrote, I just said, no, it's time now, because I've been working on it for probably about 40 years. Because the way I got interested in it was when I was back in junior high school. This is a while back now. I had a ninth grade history teacher who was great. Even in ninth grade at that time, they were having us do research projects. And he wanted me to do a research project on the battle or the campaign of Saratoga. That's when I first got an essence of St. Ledger being one of the three groups that was going to meet somewhere around Albany and try to divide the Northeast colonies from the Southern colonies and the Central colonies. I just got interested in the whole Saratoga thing. Then a couple of years later, just probably before I went to college, my father's brother, my uncle, was very interested in our family genealogy. He knew that I was interested in history and the Revolution period. So he says, by the way, Larry says, did you know we had an ancestor who fought in the New York Continental Line for 6+ years and was at the siege of Fort Stanwix? From that, I started trying to find out about him. His name was Peter Schreiber, by the way. He was from the Palatinate in Germany. Actually, he was born here, but his parents and grandparents were from the Palatinate, and they'd come over in the early 1700s. But he became very interesting to me. Those of you that have done a lot of research on the Revolution, you know about pension files and things like that. And one of the big disappointments to me was that Peter Schreiber never applied for a pension. He lived to be almost 100. He was about 98. But he was, I assume, literate. But I've never seen anything that he ever wrote. I guess even though you didn't have to show need later on in the later versions of the law, he was okay. He wasn't spectacularly wealthy or anything like that, but he did fine and had family and all of that. So he never did it. That just frustrated the heck out of me. So I decided to, just like if you know my book on Jacob Francis, you know that I had to tell about his world that he lived in as much as I did about him in order to understand him. And so I wanted to find out about the world of Peter Schreiber and put him in that to get an understanding of what he went through in his life. So long story, but that's how I got interested in this particular topic. I can't tell you how fascinating the research turned out to be.
So Fort Stanwix itself was built, I believe, during the French and Indian War. Is that correct?
That is definitely correct. Yes.
Okay.
It was built in 1758. Then didn't see a whole lot of use, like being besieged or anything like that during the French War. There were troops there. There were things that passed through and things like that, but no major activity. And it was abandoned after the French and Indian War. About 9 years after it was built, it was abandoned when the revolution broke out, and there were a ton of loyalists in the Mohawk River Valley. Our Continental Congress and Washington and everybody decided that they needed to reestablish the fort. And so they started rebuilding it, getting it back in order, and started to have garrison troops there.
And my understanding is the fort was, well, I guess it had two purposes. Originally, I guess there was some concern about the French coming down and attacking, but it also kind of served as a way of maintaining connections with the Iroquois, right? Because this was kind of built right in the middle of Iroquois country, correct?
Correct. It's built really right in the midst of the Oneida Nation.
And this is an area, I guess it was originally a portage area between stuff that was traveling between the Mohawk River and Lake Ontario, so kind of out that direction.
Yes. Yeah. If you can imagine a highway cutting across central New York from about Albany out to Lake Ontario, kind of dividing the state in half and being made up of water highways, the Mohawk River, which was about the eastern half of it, and then a couple of rivers and Lake Oneida making up the western half of the water highway. And where the two highways met was a portage area, and it was called the Oneida Portage, or the Oneida Carry Place, because of being right there in the Oneida country. And it had been an important location economically as well as politically through the whole history of New York as a colony. The fur trade, just all kinds of things came through there. And so the Oneida Carrying Place became an economic center, if you will, in colonial New York because of its location and because everybody had to stop there, and go overland and have services provided for them and things like that. So it was a very, very important area. Yeah.
Yeah, and the Oneida, I guess most of the Iroquois ended up siding with the British.
Correct.
The Oneida mostly sided with the Americans, and I guess a few of the Tuscarora did as well. So this was kind of a key to maintaining relations with our allies in this area as well. It was the point of building the fort, or rebuilding it.
When it was built in the French and Indian War, the British actually sought permission from the Oneida to build a fort there. The Oneida said, okay, because the British said, well, they're going to focus on it as a trading center, but it'll be a fortified trading center in case the French, come in or something like that. And they said, but don't worry about it because we're going to tear it down after the war. Okay, we'll still maybe have a little bit of stuff there, for trading, but the fortress aspect of it, we're going to tear down. And one of the big disappointments for the Oneida after the French Indian War ended was that they didn't tear it down. They let nature take over. It's basically a timber and earth fort. It's not stone or brick or anything like that. So it would weather away, but they never tore it down.
But it had pretty much fallen apart completely by the time of the beginning of the war, of the Revolutionary War.
Well, it had definitely fallen apart. I don't know exactly what degree, was it 60% gone, 70% gone, whatever.
Well, was there a garrison there or anything, a British garrison?
A garrison went in after the French and Indian War?
After the war ended, yeah.
Oh, no, the garrison was not there anymore.
So they just left it to rot.
They just left it to rot. There was the belief among the British and everything that it had been torn down, even though it hadn't been. And that actually played a role in problems with Reconstruction because the military people that they sent there and the engineers and whatnot thought they were going to be completely building a new fort. perhaps on the footprint of the previous one. And also, when St. Leger brings his troops down, you know how information traveled back then. There's no iPhones and everything like that. So information was not always very accurate and up to date. His concept was that it had been torn down and was only now being rebuilt and was really not in any shape of being completed, when in fact it was getting close to being completed. And that's going to be part of the reason that we won. St. Leger had a false impression of what he was going to be up against.
The Americans came back to the area in 1776, and then we have the siege beginning in early 1777, right?
Well, the siege was in August of 77, yeah. The reconstruction of the fort and the re-garrisoning of the fort started in 76, yeah.
So they had about a year to get their act together.
It was just a little over a year, more like a year and a half. You know, I mentioned that my ancestor was in the 3rd New York Regiment. They were the 3rd Continental Regiment to take over the garrisoning. And that's an interesting story in and of itself, because one of the things that I think I get across pretty well in the book is the story of the evolution of the Continental Army, starting out, you know, as basically militia guys in the central Massachusetts area. And then the Continental Army, what we often refer to as the second establishment, being the full year, end of 75 to the end of 76, the 1 year enlistments, you know, the 1 year the war was going to be over, you know, so we only need to go for a year. And then the 3rd establishment being established at the end of 75 and in the first months of 76, they're going to be 3 years of the war for their enlistment. And that's what the 3rd New York was. So the 3rd New Jersey, which was the 1st Continental Regiment to reestablish, you know, start reestablishing and re-garrisoning the fort, they weren't there for more than a few months because then their enlistments were up. And they were replaced by a Connecticut regiment who had a few more months on their enlistment because of all the problems that they'd had getting organized as part of the 2nd establishment. But then their enlistments were running out too. And it was coinciding with just the 3rd establishment of the 3rd New York finally getting them to the point where they could have a permanent assignment and not still be in training and organization and that sort of thing. So they came in as the garrison, and they were there for almost 2 years. And
the 3rd New York, that was Colonel Peter Gansevoort's regiment, and it was raised just kind of throughout most of rural New York, the central area of New York.
Well, that's a great question. Yeah. You know, all the regiments, they basically had to take recruits from their state. There were a lot of exceptions to that, but the rule was you're supposed to recruit from your own state. Colonel Gansevoort was from an Albany area family, so you got a lot of people enlisting in that area. But then his next in command, his Lieutenant Colonel, Marinus Willett, who was from New York City. And so you had, and several of the captains were from New York City, and others were from more like the Albany area. So it was all up and down the Hudson River. Basically, they got recruits. My ancestor, Peter Schreiber, was from Rhinebeck, New York, you know, on the Hudson. So that was not uncommon at all. But I think it's also really interesting that when the 3rd New York went to Fort Stanwix, they were still recruiting. The 3rd establishment, it was hard to get recruits. Even after Trenton and Princeton, you know, the good things that had happened at the end of 76, it was still hard to get recruits. And so they were recruiting while they were at Fort Stanwix, which means that they got at least a few local guys from the Mohawk River area. And that I found to be really fascinating. And as we get into the story, I'll explain more about that. But yeah, it was mostly Albany area, New York City area, I'll say Hudson River borders, and then the Mohawk Valley.
On the British side of things, this is all part of General Burgoyne's, what became known as the Saratoga campaign, because that's where
right.
This was kind of a sideshow to the general's main thrust down the Hudson River. General St. Leger to come in basically from the west, and he was eventually going to join up with Burgoyne's main army as the two marched down to Albany. Tell me a little about the army that Colonel St. Leger was commanding in this case.
First of all, let me just back up on that a bit. His objective, if you will, St. Leger's objective, taking a kind of a bend, around instead of something straight and coming in from the west while Burgoyne was coming from the north. It was supposed to be something of a diversion, as well as troops that would then join with Burgoyne. The idea being that the Americans, Gates and Schuyler, the other guys that were in the Albany area, the northern department of the Continental Army, they would have to send out troops to take care of St. Leger. And that would weaken the troops that would then be facing Burgoyne, and then St. Leger would come in to help Burgoyne out. And of course, Howe was supposed to come up from New York and never did. He liked Philadelphia so much better. Anyway, that was the purpose. I think it's really important to understand St. Leger's troops. He had some British regulars, redcoats. He had some Hessians. They were basically Jaeger. They were the light infantry, the woodsmen. He had some artillery, and he had some Canadian militia, and he had some loyalists. Now, guess where the loyalists were from? The Mohawk River Valley.
Sure. They got chased up to Canada.
They had gotten kicked out of the Mohawk River Valley when Fort Stanwix was being reestablished, first by the 3rd New Jersey, and then by the Connecticut troops, and then by the New York troops. They had gone to Canada, and Sir John Johnson, who was a major figure in the Mohawk Valley, and his father had been, William Johnson had been very, very strong and supportive in the French and Indian War, the British side. So the family was going to stay loyal to Great Britain. They had a long history with it. So it's going to be a lot of people from the Mohawk Valley region coming down to attack Fort Stanwix. And Fort Stanwix is going to be defended by the 3rd New York, which had Mohawk River guys in it, although they were the minority. But they also had Oneida Indians helping them out at the siege, defending the fort, who knew a lot of these guys that were in the attacking army. There were Iroquois Indians, as well as some other nations. A lot of Mohawks, for example, with Joseph Brant, is a name you might recognize. It really is a good symbol of the Civil War nature of the whole campaign in the Mohawk Valley. It's very interesting. I think a key element among those troops were two things. Number one, the Iroquois, the Mohawks and whatnot, didn't want to have a long campaign. They wanted to get things done. They also didn't want to take a lot of casualties. Now, we often think of, the Native Americans, the warriors, they're going out. These are fighters. They're going to go full tilt. Well, they were good fighters, no question about that. But they also had on their mind survival of their nation, not just them as individuals, because the colonial period with the Iroquois was a long period, well over 100 years, of contact with white settlers that brought in diseases. And there was a lot of conflict, struggles for land and things like that. Mm-hmm. And the Iroquois in general, all of the Six Nations, were decimated before the Revolution. They had expanded their population by adopting whatever, Iroquois, Mohawk, whatever the nation was. They were adopting people into their nation. And I found that to be a fascinating thing, because many of I'll talk mostly about the Oneidas, since they were the primary ones that I looked at. They were, I'll use the term, mixed race. The Iroquois traced their ancestry and their tribal lineage through the mother. It was a matriarchal society. So if a white European man developed a child with a Oneida woman or a Mohawk woman or whatever, the child was considered to be Oneida or Mohawk. They also might adopt Indians from other nations, sometimes outside the Iroquois. So the population was really kind of mixed, and they were truly trying to keep their nations together. And therefore, yeah, we're going to fight, but we're not going to try to get into battles that are going to have high casualties. We're going to hit and run. We're going to do all kind of guerrilla warfare, things like that. But if you're going to attack something like Fort Stanwix, don't ask us to go charge the walls and take a bunch of casualties in trying to capture this fort or anything. So that was one factor that's going to affect the siege. Another factor is going to be that I mentioned that St. Ledger had incomplete information about what he was going to be facing at Fort Stanwix. I mentioned he brought artillery, not much, and it was pretty small scale. It was not big stuff, and it was not numerous. The artillery at Fort Stanwix was totally inadequate for what it was supposed to have. I don't know how many of you know what Fort Stanwix looked like, but it was basically a square fort with a bastion at each corner. And the bastions, with their ramparts and everything, had embrasures for 30 some artillery pieces. They had about 10. They couldn't put more than 2 or 3 artillery in any bastion. And some of them were small 3-pounders, on traveling carriages. They weren't on.
Yeah, they were mostly more used for field.
Yeah. So they were under strength. But St. Ledger was even more under strength.
Yeah.
He didn't even have as much as the fort did. That's going to affect the siege greatly. St. Ledger is not going to have any real chance of defeating the fort. It's going to go on for 3 weeks. He's going to be shooting at it with his artillery for 3 weeks. He's going to try to do a lot more with exploding shells than with solid shot, because he's going to try to fire it into the fort rather than try to have cannonballs embedded in the earth walls of the fort. So most of the casualties for the defenders are going to be from exploding shells and also from sniper fire from outside. But there's never going to be a massive charge against the fort. There's going to be constant daily casualties, if you will, but not huge numbers at any one time.
St. Leger first gets there, he demands the fort surrender, and they, of course, refuse.
Oh, yeah. As soon as he realized, and he had an oops moment, when he finally saw the thing and saw that it was somewhat more than he thought it was going to be, even though it was really not complete. The soldiers continued to not only defend the fort, but to work on restoring the fort during the siege. I can't defeat these guys, but I'm not going to let them know that.
Yeah.
They don't know if I don't have more artillery coming up the river, and it's going to be unloaded here in a day or two, because it was only the second or third day of the siege. So he gets the white flag, and gets a guy to go out, and the guy gets escorted back into the fort. They blindfold him so that he can't see all of the problems inside the fort that they're trying to restore. And they get him into a room, and then they talk to him. And basically, he has a letter saying, you better surrender now, or if you have to surrender later after we attack, there's no promise that I can keep the Indians from massacring you. Just doing a throwback to the French and Indian War and Fort William Henry, at Lake George and the massacre there when they surrendered. So Gansevoort and Willett, they said, no way, we're defending. They didn't surrender.
The British did have a significantly larger force than were.
Oh, in manpower, yes. Not in artillery, but in manpower.
And I guess they had some reason to hope, because a few weeks earlier, the Continentals had surrendered Fort Ticonderoga without a fight, and that was a proper fort.
Yeah. I think that St. Ledger may have been okay to expect that they might surrender, given that experience. The nickname of Fort Stanwix is the fort that never surrendered, because not only did Fort Ticonderoga surrender, but a number of other forts did. There's an interesting quote, I think it was from John Adams, saying something to the effect, the only way we're ever going to hold a fort is to execute one of these colonels that's in charge of one who surrenders it. Unless we do that, these guys are going to keep surrendering forts. When Fort Stanwix survived the siege and Gansevoort did not surrender, by the way, that offer to have them surrender was repeated before the end of the surrender, and he denied it again. But that was one of the things that really got him a lot of notice among the high-ranking elements of the Army and the Continental Congress. He didn't surrender. That was unusual at that time.
So he was also counting on a relief force coming to help him, right?
Yes. One of the things that the Oneidas could do was get out of the fort, and they knew their way around. They could get through the besiegers, and they could get messages here and there. And actually, also, Lieutenant Colonel Willett, probably with Oneida help, was able to get out of the fort one night and get away and actually head for Albany in that area to let them know what was going on and what was needed. It was about the August the 6th, not long after that first attempt to get the fort to surrender, that a local group of militia, patriot militia, and local Oneidas, supporting the American cause, gathered together and tried to come to the fort and, attack the besiegers on the outside while Gansevoort was defending the fort on the inside. And between those two, destroy the besiegers. That group, unfortunately, became known to St. Ledger before they got there. It was actually the sister of Joseph Brant, who had remained in the valley, even though the others had gone on to Canada. She was able to alert St. Ledger. So he sent away part of his troops, mostly his Indian allies, along with some of his loyalists and all. And they went and ambushed the group coming to relieve the fort. And that became a very, I think, well-known battle from the Revolution, the Battle of Oriskany. Yeah. It was actually an attempt to relieve the fort, and it didn't work. A number of people were killed. It's one of the deadliest battles in the Civil War and in the Revolution.
Yeah, in terms of percentage of.
And it was definitely a Civil War battle because it was primarily the Loyalists and the Patriots from the Mohawk River Valley, as well as Iroquois Indians from both sides, Patriot and Loyalists, who were in that battle, killing each other. So it was definitely a Civil War kind of thing. And a few British guys, along with the locals. And of course, Gansevoort could have gotten totally discouraged at that point and said, okay, maybe I do have to surrender. I'm not going to get relieved. But he kept at it. He kept defending.
During the Battle of Oriskany, they had an offensive sally out of the fort and destroyed the British camp.
Right. During the Battle of Oriskany, Lieutenant Colonel Willett took about 250 guys out of the fort. And the idea was they were going to go and support the guys at Oriskany. Yeah. But they never got there because they diverted and they found empty camps of all these guys that St. Ledger had sent down to Oriskany, and they looted them.
Yeah.
They literally looted them.
Which was a huge morale failure for especially the Indians, because that was like they carried
the light. Just going to say that the ones that were really hurt and angered by that were the Indians, no question. They were able to do that without losing a man, and they got back in the fort before the troops got back. The small number of men that St. Ledger had stayed behind, he tried to get them to attack Willett, but it didn't really work out. So Willett was able to get all kind of good stuff that they needed at the fort and deny it to the British. Again, the Indian allies of the British were the ones really angered by what Willett did. So they're kind of on the verge of, let's get this thing over with, even more than St. Ledger and the British soldiers. So he tries to hang out. Finally, they're going to win the siege because St. Ledger is going to disappear. He's just going to take off one night. This is about August the 22nd. And the reason he takes off is because back at the main American forces in the Albany area, they had gotten word about what was going on, and they decided to scare St. Ledger away. Now remember, St. Ledger is supposed to get a bunch of troops pulled off from the main American army as a diversion, like I said, to get him out of Burgoyne's way so that he can take care of the other Americans there. What they decide to do is they get a local loyalist from the Mohawk Valley, who's kind of a strange bird. He was, I want to say, an unusual character. I don't know quite what his mental issues were, but he had something.
Yeah, the Indians thought he was crazy.
Yeah. I mean, he had various opinions about him. A lot of the local Indians really thought he was something cool because of his antics and all. They thought he had connections to the spirits, and things like that. But he had been taken into captivity and was told he was going to be hung. But they said, well, we'll let you off if you'll go out to Fort Stanwix and spread the word to St. Ledger and particularly to his Indian allies that there's a relief force of several thousand troops under Benedict Arnold who are coming to the relief of Fort Stanwix. Well, yeah, they were going to send some troops. It wasn't thousands.
Right. And Benedict Arnold really was coming, but I think this was
he really was coming. He really was coming.
Plan to send this notice. But yeah, he was coming, but yeah, he didn't have thousands. He had hundreds.
No, he didn't have thousands. What they did after they sent Hanyo Schuyler, the crazy guy,
right.
They also sent an Indian after him to tell the same story and reinforce it. Technically, somebody not connected to him, but who understood the same story. So those two guys told St. Ledger and particularly told the Indians, and the Indians said, "Okay, we're out of here." At that point, St. Ledger looked around and said, "Well, if they're leaving, my guys are sick and tired of this siege too, because we're not getting anywhere with it. We're just taking casualties every day. We'll get out of here too." So it was actually Han Yost Schuyler who appeared at the fort after he had talked with St. Ledger and St. Ledger was leaving. He came in and told Gansevoort and Willett, that he had left. Gansevoort sent troops out, but the British were long gone.
Yeah, they hightailed it back to the lake as fast as they could and sailed off.
Yeah.
I always say with some exaggeration, I guess, that Benedict Arnold single-handedly won this by
Oh, yeah.
this whole thing.
It was just his name that did it.
Yeah. This was a big deal because it essentially took away what Burgoyne thought was going to be a major distraction for the Americans and also denied Burgoyne these reinforcements that he would expect to eventually receive. And so it played a big role in Burgoyne's eventual surrender.
Exactly. Yeah. St. Ledger had it in his mind that he's going to join Burgoyne, but he's going to go back to Lake Ontario. He's going to cut across in some way and join up with him. But it's not going to be in time.
Yeah, I think he got as far as Ticonderoga before he heard about the surrender.
Yeah, he was on his way when he heard about it. Yeah.
So this was really the fort's big event in the war. What happened to the fort afterwards?
It's important to know that there was still concern about British activity and loyalist activity in the Mohawk Valley.
There was a lot of raiding going on in the next few years. Butler's Rangers and Joseph Brant and all those guys were still very active.
The revolution in the Mohawk Valley is a whole story in itself that needs to have a lot of time to talk about or to research. I mean, it was every day of the revolution, there was something going on in the Mohawk Valley. It really highlights how the revolution was a civil war and just incredibly destructive. Communities split fighting each other, families split fighting each other, just so many breakups in the society and everything. And that, of course, damaged the culture, the economy, everything in the Mohawk Valley. And there was also, the idea that British troops might come back through there, that the British might send more Native Americans into the valley to knock off the Patriots and that kind of thing and aid the Loyalists. So they wanted to keep troops there. They kept troops there until 1781. They didn't quite make it through the whole war. The 3rd New York was there.
They kept troops there. They just didn't bother to feed them anymore.
Well, they always had trouble feeding them.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things about this fort, for the guys that were in the garrison, they were out at the end of the line for anything. They were, when you want to talk about frontier, the next white settlement to Fort Stanwix in the Mohawk Valley was 35 miles away down the river. And there were Oneida settlements, several of them, closer to Fort Stanwix. And of course, they were friendly. But if they wanted to get food from the continental stores and things like that, it had to go overland, it had to go on the water. It was so hard to get there. Throughout pretty much the rest of the time that the 3rd New York was there, which was until November of 78, when they got supplies, they had to send troops from Fort Stanwix, that 35 miles down to that settlement. And there was a small fort there, Fort Dayton. And then they had to escort the supplies back to Fort Stanwix. If they didn't send escorts, they didn't get supplies because those supplies were going to be attacked by loyalist Native Americans as well as settler loyalists. But they were primarily concerned about the Native Americans. So it was constant feeling that you're under siege, even though you weren't technically under siege. If you went out of the fort, you might get attacked and scalped. There were so many incidents of individual people and small work parties from the fort going out, fatigue parties, going out to get wood, going out to get whatever, and the supply escorts, things like that. Men were getting killed all the time and basically also scalped, if not just scalped. So it was not any fun. The fort wasn't in a, shall we say, a civilized area with all kind of stuff going on that would be diversion. All they had was, we're stuck in the fort because we might get attacked and we got to make sure that we're on guard. Every day was, they were on alert. Every few days, or certainly within every couple of weeks, somebody was getting massacred outside the fort. And so it was no fun. I think it's important, not so important, but certainly good to know and interesting to know that these guys didn't want to be at that fort. They wanted to be with the George Washington and the main army. Somebody like Gansevoort or Willett, the captains of the companies, they not necessarily looking like a professional in our army would look at promotion today, and looking at a career in the army. But they were looking for recognition and the potential for promotion. And being stuck off on the edge of civilization where they were, that wasn't going to happen. So they desperately wanted to get out of there and get with the army. It would be more interesting also than just day in and day out worried about what's going to happen at the fort now. And am I going to get a meal today or not? They were just so anxious to get the heck out of there.
Yeah, and I guess the 3rd New York went on to fight in the Sullivan campaign in 79, right?
Yes, the 3rd New York definitely was part of the Sullivan campaign.
I think they got replaced by the 1st New York took over the garrison of the
At the
fort.
garrison, the 1st New York took over for them, at least for a while. I don't remember exactly how long they were there.
I guess the 3rd came back because then they had that desertion problem, right?
Everybody had a desertion problem.
Well, there was the incident where they executed a bunch of deserters.
Oh, yeah. Gansevoort wound up in a situation where he had to do what a colonel wasn't supposed to do. Yeah. And that was not only declare a death penalty on somebody, but also carry it out. And part of the reason he did that was because he was so far removed from everything. When the siege was over and he got so much recognition for not surrendering, keeping everything together, he was given the title of Fort Commander, in addition to being Colonel Commandant. And that was not a rank title so much as what it meant was if anybody else, any other unit came who happened to have a colonel with them, Gansevoort was going to outrank that colonel, even if that colonel had more time and rank and that kind of thing. Yeah. So that gave him a lot more prestige and power than just being colonel of the regiment. He was Colonel Commandant of the fort.
And I guess the fort itself, you said, was abandoned in 1781, and that had more to do with destruction of the fort by weather than by the enemy, right?
Yes. There was a lot of, I would guess I'd call it flood damage, wind damage, like hurricane damage, stuff like that. Too much water around, falling, that kind of thing that pretty much destroyed it. And then it wasn't 100% destroyed, and they still had some personnel there. Mm-hmm. And then it burned. The barracks burned and stuff like that.
Yeah, there's actually some suspicion that the garrison set the fire just so
They wanted out of there. You know? So yeah, there is definite suspicion that it was, if not man set, certainly not controlled and taken advantage of. I think it's important to note that Fort Stanwix not only served a military purpose as a defensive position on this main transportation route, it also was a location for conferences and treaties and things like that. Before the end of the French and Indian War, there'd been conferences there with the Indians and that kind of thing. But after the siege, there were several conferences that were held there. And even after the fire, the ruins were still used because of the
the 17
strategic location and that kind of thing. They still would take
yeah.
people there to meet.
No, the famous 1784 Treaty of Fort Stanwix was.
Yes, exactly.
So that was kind of the end of the fort. As you said, it was still used as a meeting place, the location, but the fort itself was basically ruins at that point. There was
Correct.
left of it. The area that the fort stands in is now Rome, New York.
Yes.
And I understand that they eventually rebuilt the fort and made it into a national monument. This, I guess, happened during the Great Depression. Is that right?
Basically, it started out. Yeah, they finished the reconstruction and everything right around the time of the bicentennial, but it started. I think it started in the 30s. Yeah.
I know President Roosevelt, FDR, was the one who created the national monument. I guess, yeah, it took them probably decades to actually. They rebuilt the fort. It exists there as a reproduction of
well, it's a reproduction, yes, but I want to emphasize it is on the footprint of the original. They did extensive archaeology before reconstructing it. And even today, if you go to visit the fort, there are a couple of places in the fort where you go in and you can actually see brick structures that were part of cooking fires in the barracks and things like that, or in the bomb proofs, and things like that were in the walls of the fort. There are archaeological remains visible to the public in the same spot of the fort where they were originally. They haven't been moved somewhere.
Yeah.
So it definitely is right on the footprint. It's a perfect replica of the fort. Now, to do that, they had to tear down a whole business area.
It had been built over at one point.
It was kind of an economic blow to Rome, New York. And one of the things that I picked up, particularly after I wrote the book and was asked to come up here to talk about it occasionally, I ran into people who said, this national monument thing here, it's ruined our town.
Mm-hmm.
Even though we get tourists and things like that, who come to see the National Park Service stuff here, it just took a huge chunk out of our town, out of our city.
Yeah, it's kind of right in the middle of downtown.
Yeah, right. Well, I'd like to ask everybody if you had ever heard of Fort Stanwix before.
And I'm opening up this to questions now, so feel free to unmute and join the conversation.
I can't tell you, several of the talks that I've given on this, I have asked that to a live audience and everything. And I had 30-some people the other day, and only one hand went up when I asked if they had ever heard of Fort Stanwix.
Well, I saw the movie.
Oh, there you go. I've heard of it, but I didn't know as much detail, so thank you.
Remember the movie with Henry Fonda?
Drums Along the Mohawk, yeah. That's the story, yeah.
That was the Battle of Oriskany, I believe.
Yeah, Oriskany gets in there and Drums Along the Mohawk, yeah.
And the general who was killed.
Herkimer?
Yeah, thank you.
And now it's also interesting to me that, again, when I gave a talk in the Mohawk Valley, the first one that I gave, the book was published in November, and it was virtually the weekend that it was released. The people who came to the talk obviously were from that area. It was heartening to have people come up to me after the talk and everything and thank me for writing the book, because they didn't know about Fort Stanwix, even though it was right there. They hadn't really gotten into the story. Nobody had ever, I guess the schools don't do much with, or whatever. They just appreciated. Also, they commented because I wrote it from the point of view of people and not just institutions and things like that. nor was it just about the structure of the fort and that sort of thing, but it was a lot about their Mohawk Valley history and the Civil War aspect of it and things like that. And so the book really helped them understand their area.
So I have a question. How much do you talk about the role of the Oneida in your book? I'm interested in like the feud between Brant and Hanieri, so between the Mohawks and the Oneida. And I'm wondering if you can give me some ideas for maybe other things to read if, that you've seen when you're researching it on that issue of the Oneida.
Yeah, there's several very good books. Two books that I would really recommend are The Iroquois and the American Revolution.
Yeah, I've read that too.
And who's that by?
Barbara Graymont.
Thank you.
And a really good book is Forgotten Allies.
I've read that one actually.
Okay.
And that is excellent. I've read it twice.
Yeah. You'll find a lot of footnotes in my book relating to it. Unfortunately, James Kirby Martin, who was one of the two authors on that, just passed away not too long ago.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, and I will just add that I have an ancestor who at age 14 fought at Oriskany.
Oh, okay. Well, one thing that I found really, I kind of tease people who ask me why how I got interested in this, being from New Jersey and having written so much about the Revolution. Well, in Trenton, I live just in a suburb of Trenton. During the Revolution, the Presbyterian minister at Trenton was Reverend Elihu Spencer. I had done a lot of work on him. He did all kind of things, with the Battle of Trenton time, and things like that, being in Trenton. Then when I was doing the research for this book, I kept running into an Oneida Indian named Thomas Spencer. I figured, okay, same name. And Thomas Spencer, I found out, was one of these who had a white father and an Oneida mother and had been adopted into the Oneida tribe, but also circulated in the white settlement. He was bilingual. He was an interpreter. He could write exceptionally well. And he also helped out at Fort Stanwix by doing a lot of scouting of St. Ledger as he was coming and that kind of thing. So he was a real main support of our forces at Fort Stanwix. So I was looking into his life, and genealogy and that kind of thing. And guess who his father was? Elihu Spencer, the Presbyterian missionary who spent a short time in the Mohawk Valley just after he got out of college and then went on to Trenton. And I don't think anybody in Trenton knows that Elihu Spencer, their local hero, was the father of a Oneida son who helped out in the Revolution. But I became very interested in the Oneida. I really did, doing this.
Didn't Martin write a biography of Benedict Arnold?
Oh, James Kirby Martin was very, very knowledgeable of Benedict Arnold, yes.
Yeah, I think I read one of his almost an apologia for Benedict.
Oh, yeah, no, he was one who was not going to knock Benedict Arnold down.
Well, I was just astonished to discover that not only did Benedict Arnold win the Battle of Saratoga single-handedly, but he also won the Battle of he saved Fort Stanwix with his fake out reinforcement deployment that scared away the Indians.
Mm-hmm.
At least that would be Kirby's interpretation.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and this was the same time he was still trying to deal with the Burgoyne's army at Saratoga.
Right. First, Arnold took care of the fort with the fake reinforcements, and then he took care of Saratoga a couple months later, apparently. And then then everything went downhill because he was so badly wounded that he had a change of heart.
Yeah,
he actually did come to Fort Stanwix, but didn't stay very long.
Oh, did he?
Yeah. And he, as we said, he did bring some troops, but they went right back. Yeah, it was not a real good diversion.
I always say, I wish Arnold had been killed at the very end of the Saratoga battle. He would have been the all-American hero.
Absolutely.
He'd be number one.
He'd be the greatest hero of the American Revolution.
Yeah.
I do have a question. I guess first I'd like you to confirm dates, and then I'd ask you to entertain a scenario. I believe St. Ledger left Montreal late June 77, arrived Oswego late July 77. Ticonderoga had been taken in early July. Is there any chance that he knew that Burgoyne made it through Ticonderoga quickly? Is there a chance that a scout had made it to him and that he was under the impression that Burgoyne was sort of flying down the Hudson?
I honestly don't know what he knew.
And so I ask that just because if the objective of his campaign was to occupy Patriot forces in the Mohawk Valley, he was there for multiple weeks. He got the great Benedict Arnold to come out with thousands of troops. I wonder if he actually felt like he did his job. Like, I wonder if he left thinking that he accomplished his mission and actually helped. And I wonder if you have thoughts on that.
Well, my thoughts on that are going to be speculative based on what I know about St. Ledger in general. He did not think lightly of himself. He thought highly of himself. When he led his forces from Montreal down, he held the rank, and I use that term loosely, of brigadier general. He was really a lieutenant colonel. It was only brigadier general for this expedition. After the expedition, he would have reverted right back to lieutenant colonel. The only reason he got that quote unquote promotion is because he was the senior lieutenant colonel who didn't go with Burgoyne. So Burgoyne had to kind of make him a general because he's leading an army. He's not just, leading a regiment or whatever. It's a combined force. They also really weren't thinking too well in putting St. Ledger in charge. Yes, he had some experience, but not a lot. And as several historians about St. Ledger pointed out, he had no experience in the wilderness, and he had precious little experience with Native Americans. Now, sending him on this expedition, he's going to be in the wild, and he's going to be a mass of his troops are going to be Native American. He was not the guy to be put in charge there. He also thought so highly of what he was doing that he didn't bring enough artillery. And I can tell you that one of the groups that were attacked outside the fort before the siege, several of the 3rd New York guys were captured and they were interrogated, not exactly by St. Ledger, but by his officers in the same area with him. One way or another, St. Ledger's officers got the idea that he didn't have enough artillery, that he was going to have a mess when he tried to take Fort Stanwix. And he told them to buzz off, that everything was fine. So I think he probably didn't feel too bad, even though he had to leave. I think he probably blamed it on the Indians, who wouldn't stand and fight with Arnold, quote unquote, on the way. And also the fact that his own soldiers, he was having trouble with desertions. Several of his guys deserted to Fort Stanwix and to Gansevoort and whatnot. I would say that he was probably not too hard on himself.
Thank you.
Do you have a question, Bob?
Yes, Larry. What happened to St. Ledger after Saratoga? Because I don't hear his name coming up through the rest of the war.
That's a great question, and one that I have never really followed up on.
He's continued to serve as the commander of the Rangers in Montreal for the rest of the war.
Okay.
He didn't do anything, is basically what happened. At one point, tried to lead a raid to kidnap General Schuyler, and he was also involved in negotiations with Ethan Allen to try to get Vermont to rejoin Connecticut. Mm. But obviously, neither of those things panned out. The end of his life is actually a mystery. Nobody knows what happened. He resigned his commission in 1785 when he was still in Canada. He went home, and all I've seen after that is that his name disappeared from the Army rolls. That's all I know.
And also, to add to that, if you've ever seen a portrait of St. Ledger, it's fake.
Oh, is it?
Yeah. Or it was done by somebody who never saw him. So it's not a real likeness. A lot of books, you'll see it. There's actually a couple variations on it. but none of them are accurate.
Thank you.
So he's something of a mystery.
Larry, I really want to thank you for coming and talking to us today. Your book, again, Defending Fort Stanwix, is already out. So everybody, if you want to go grab a copy, I put a link to the Amazon on the invitation I sent you, so you can use that link to go check it out if you want to.
Could I put in a plug?
Sure.
If you want to order it from Fort Plain.
Fort Plain Museum, yeah.
Yeah, they have a website, for the Fort Plain Museum, and you can order the book from them. It helps support Fort Plain. And they were extremely helpful to me. Looking at the names of everybody here, I know some of you really know Fort Plain.
Yeah.
For those that don't, they are very supportive of people like me and people like you. They put on all kind of really good programming there and everything. And their bookstore, their gift shop and all that really does help them.
Yeah, if you're ever in the area, man, their bookstore is the most amazing American Revolution bookstore I've ever seen. They have every book you can think of, and quite a few you haven't thought of.
Yes.
All right, well, we're going to wrap things up then. Yeah, Larry, thanks again. Just remember, guys, we meet the second Wednesday of every month, so we'll be meeting again in March. I don't have a guest name for you yet, but I'm sure I will have someone the next week or two. Appreciate y'all coming out, and see y'all next month, hopefully.
Once again, I would like to thank Larry Kidder for joining us on our roundtable to discuss his book, Defending Fort Stanwix. If you'd like to purchase the book, I've included links in the show notes, as well as links to some of his earlier books. Once again, if you want to participate live in a future roundtable event, be sure to be on my mailing list or join as a member on Patreon. We've got some great authors coming up this year, and I think it will be a fun experience to participate live. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another regular episode of the American Revolution podcast.